Hello, everyone. Thank you very much for being with us today and with the 2021 TRT World Forum. It's a pleasure to have this exciting lineup of speakers. Of course, the theme of today in this expert roundtable is about the future of the Turkish-Arab relations, and it's about the new realignments that we are seeing in the region. And we are very excited to have you all. Thank you for accepting our invitation. We have with us three prominent speakers and a panel of discussants. So first of all, I would like to introduce our speakers, and then I will introduce our discussants. First to speak in order would be Her Excellency Ayşe Sözen Usluer. Her Excellency is an ambassador of the Turkish Republic in the Sultanate of Oman. She held a multiple position within the Department of the International Relations Departments at the Presidency of the Turkish Republic, and also had multiple stints at the Foreign Affairs Ministry before that. Also with us today is His Excellency Ahmet Yıldız. Ahmet Yıldız also has a deep expertise of the region. He has been ambassador in many areas of the Arab world, ranging from Iraq, Syria, Libya, Saudi Arabia, and he also is currently the chairman of the Turkish delegation at the Parliamentary Assembly of the Council of Europe. He is also a member of Parliament, and this also will give us good hints about the making of the Turkish foreign policy from an internal point of view, from a parliamentary level. And also I would like to welcome Mr. Altikriti, who is well known in the NGO world and well known in multiple initiatives and activities dealing with the Arab world, but also the Arabic diaspora in the world, and with very good knowledge of the Turkish-Arab relations. So thank you, our speakers. We are very delighted to have you on board. It's really a pleasure. We also will have discussants with us to debate and ask questions and intervene and have their own perspectives on things, and ask our speakers on multiple points that will be raised. So I would like to welcome Danya Dafer. She is the executive director of the Gulf International Forum. She comes with a very good knowledge of especially Gulf affairs, but also Arab affairs in general, and the Turkish-Arab relations from a Gulf point of view. And we'll have Dr. Ufuk Ulutaş, who is the chairman of the Center for Strategic Research, SAM, at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. With us as well, Hafsa Halawa. Welcome, Hafsa, on board. It's a pleasure to have you. Hafsa is a non-resident scholar at the Middle East Institute, but also she's a visiting fellow at the ECFR, the European Council for Foreign Relations. Last but not least, we have Dr. Tahir Kılavuz. Thank you, Tahir, for joining our panel of discussants. Dr. Tahir Kılavuz is assistant professor in the Department of Political Science and International Relations at Marmara University. So just to outline some points, so we will, as we have our ladies on board, so we'll go ladies first, and Her Excellency Ambassador Ayşe will go first, and then we'll have His Excellency Ahmet Yıldız as the second speaker, and then Dr. Altikriti will be number three. So without further ado, the floor is yours, Your Excellency.
Good afternoon, all from Oman. Mr. President, I would like to thank TRT World for inviting me to the Experts Roundtable. It's nice to be in this platform second time after last year, and it's also nice to see some friends here after a long time. Indeed, the title of the forum this year is Challenging Power and Paradox, Understanding Grand Strategy in the 21st Century. But of course, highly timely to discuss grand strategies while we as the whole world passing through COVID-19 pandemic altogether and still not seeing the end of the tunnel and experiencing how much powerless we are against a tiny virus. So it seems like power itself carries a lot of paradoxes in itself. It is very unfortunate so far the leaders, thinkers, scientists, or practitioners could not come together to discuss this issue. They couldn't come together to try to figure out the future of the world if we will continue with likewise epidemic diseases. Nor the situation changed in the Middle East. Middle East passing through the pandemic under the same conditions, unfortunately. The war in Syria, Yemen continues like nothing happened. Occupation continues in Palestine. The countries like Libya, Iran, Afghanistan did not make any change towards being more stable, prosperous, and peaceful countries. Rather, there emerge more complexities in those countries. And we are not aware that what are the number of the cases in those countries and what are the percentage of vaccine people, what is the health system is like, what is this infrastructure is like in those countries, unless we are a specialist on one of those countries. Last decade marked by increased uncertainties, unpredictabilities, crises and conflicts, threatening peace and stability, accelerated rivalries among regional and global powers, as well as the erosion of multilateralism and universal values. Under these circumstances, today we are going to talk about the realignments in the Middle East and the future of Turkish-Arab relations. I can automatically talk about the basics of Turkish foreign policy. Our policy in the region based on dialogue, maintaining security, peace, and prosperity for all and justice for all. Turkey pursues enterprising and humanitarian foreign policy in the region as it is in the rest of the world. As a part of its general perspective towards the region, Turkey strives to increase its political, economic, social, and cultural cooperation and engagement with the Middle Eastern countries. In this framework, Turkey's vision for its future with the Arab countries is to establish and develop those relations within a politically and security-wise stable environment and on the basis of the win-win principle. However, how come we can talk about Turkish-Arab relations without its immediate connotations, which are Ottomanism, imperialism, New Ottomanism, Turanism, and so on, whatever you would like to call it. Through coining these terms, Arabs are reminded if they have any positive developed relations with Turkey, Turks will be at their door and will occupy their lands or to dominate their country or politics, whatever. Unfortunately, when we want to talk about Turkish-Arab relations, we don't really mean it. We are not free to talk about bilateral Turkish-Arab relations. We are not free to be rational, to think in the context of contemporary international system, to discuss even the mutual interests of our countries. We are just polluted with the old-fashioned ideas of the early 20th century. A decade before, a century before, Turkish-Arab relations shaped or artificially shaped by this big brother likening discourse. And I'm sure Mr. Tikriti has a lot to say about this point. During the last 4 or 5 years, in the communiques, declarations, or decisions of some Arab League summits, Turkey's political cooperations with the regional countries or military operations against terrorist groups in the region assessed from the same false consciousness. They were claimed to be the ambitious Ottomanist attempts of Turkey to occupy Arab lands. And in the same documents, Turkey's support and the bilateral agreements, for instance, with Libyan Legal National Accord government or with the new National Unity government, considered as the interference of Turkey into the domestic affairs of Arab countries. This way of approach to our relation is entirely irrational. Today, every single country in the region is aware of the fact that we do not live in an imperial era, nor in the bipolar system of the Cold War. Neither we don't live in the unipolar world order desired to be established after 1990s. We are aware that we are independent sovereign countries who can formulate their cooperation in the context of increasingly interdependent world. For me, it is this false consciousness or artificially built subconscious prevent us to establish and develop healthy relations in the region in today's world. As a matter of fact, Turks and Arabs live in the same ecosystem. Our lands, coasts, seas, sources, resources are side by side. We have a common history, culture, and religion. We have similar economic parameters. We even share same destiny, like same disasters, wildfires of last summer, earthquakes, floods, and so on. Our country is threatened by terrorism nourished by the chaotic atmosphere in the region. Turkish-Arab relations has to be understood and established in the context of same ecosystem, and then policies need to be developed accordingly. We also have to take into account that there is no one single Arab land. We have to establish our relations mutually bilateral between Turkey and each individual Arab country, bearing in mind, of course, the regional concerns of the Middle East. So there is need to be purified from emotions and to become a bit more rational during these realignments. One may argue Turkish politics in the region is imperialist, Ottomanist, new Ottomanist. However, nobody can argue that Turkey's policies are illegal or violating the international law. In Palestine, we are against occupation. We support the two-state solution with the 1967 borders with the East Jerusalem is the capital of Palestine based on UN resolutions. In Libya, we support UN recognized government of national unity. In Syria, our operations is the right to self-defense. Our policy in the Gulf is to support unity, prosperity, and security of the Gulf states. We can continue like this about Yemen, Afghanistan, Iran, but no need. Obviously, there are realignments on the ground today. Turkey, Egypt, Saudi, UAE, Egypt, and Qatar, UAE, Syria, Saudi, Yemen, whatever it is, for me, this is a result of the understanding the interdependency of regional countries, understanding of the reality that we need to talk face to face to sort out our problems about seas, coasts, lands. We cannot draw our maritime lines without each other. We cannot discuss natural gas of East Mediterranean Sea without each other. Expo 2020 in Dubai is missing with the Turkish stand in Expo, or defense sector tenders in the region is not competitive enough without Turkish products. So Arab societies would like to come to Turkey, enjoy the coasts in the south and forests and greens in the north in the winter time. Turks would like to enjoy their business and friendship with Arab countries. So we are incomplete without each other. So it is this interdependency in our common ecosystem will be the main driver for re-establishing relations for the next decade. I'm quite hopeful about it, hopeful about these new starts. After a century, we got a chance to establish, to make our destiny by ourselves without major interventions of foreign powers. There is a rise of self-awareness of our power, and paradoxes of sovereignty and interdependency can be overcome and formulated if we are free from the imposed ideas into our brains. So I think I already accessed my time limit. Before stopping, I just would like to emphasize with one sentence that I can clearly say that as a person in the region, Turkish regional politics are understood in the Arab streets very well and appreciated very much by the people of Arab countries, despite the entirely opposite propaganda of international media. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Your Excellency Ambassador Ayşe, for this starting note. And yeah, there were very important points that you raised. I think some of them are thought-provoking. I think the floor now is for His Excellency Ahmet Yıldız.
Thank you, Tarek Bey. As you explained, indeed, I spent most of my diplomatic life in Arab countries, in Libya, in Syria, Iraq, and in Saudi Arabia, Memleket. But now, as an MP, my main task in the foreign affairs is relevant to Council of Europe. I am head of Turkish delegation, and I am member of NATO Parliamentary Assembly, and I am head of Turkish-Libya Friendship Group. Hopefully, we will continue to work on this in the future. Indeed, after this wonderful speech, indeed, from Turkish side, no need for another speech. She summarized very well everything. But I will touch on some points, conceptual points, that may provoke some questions for discussants. It is better to discuss that way. In my opinion, after all this experience as diplomat in Arab countries and in the departments of foreign ministry and advisor to the President Erdogan, I got a lot of insight accompanying his meetings with Arab leaders. I think about the European dimension is contributing to my assessments. I think the main problem in this relationship is the sustainability. Sustainability is a kind of fashion word, but it is very relevant in Turkish-Arab relations. I remember one of our prominent diplomats once told me that Turkish-Arab relations is a kind of relations between two brothers in arguing, in loving and arguing, but I think it's a kind of cousins relationship. Arguing is very harsh, reactions sometimes are very harsh, emotions are very harsh. That's why sustainability is important. Why I am saying this? During my diplomatic life, and especially when I was in the presidency and I was deputy foreign minister, in short terms, even in 1 year, 2 years, 3 years, the mood of the relationship between Turkey and major Arab powers changed 3 or 4 times. Of course, it is affected by other factors. So to provide this sustainability and proportionality, which are very fashion words now in the West. Of course, emphasis on religion, common history, culture is good basis, but it is not enough. We should focus on some practical steps. Some of them may be relevant to the fundamental principles of international relations, and some others are such economic interdependency and recognition of each other's particularities, sensitivities, and especially their responsibilities on the other parts of the world. Although Turkey is neighbor to 2 important Arab countries, Syria and Iraq, bordering, but as Ayşe said, we should ask these questions from Turkish side always. That, even if is your title, when you say Turkish-Arab relations, do you mean is it between Turkey and all Arab countries, or between Arab countries and Turkish countries? Now we have Turkish countries other than Turkey too, and we have also Turkish Cypriot state. in the Mediterranean. In my diplomatic life, I can say this is not realistic and this is not helpful. For example, when you take Turkey into consideration, Turkey cannot adjust its positions every time in dealing with a particular Arab country, waiting for the position of all other countries. Because Turkey has rightful interests, as Arab countries have their particular interests with other countries. So it is not realistic, but we can always take, and we can take always into consideration the sensitivities and responsibilities. For example, Turkey has responsibilities also in other parts of the world, in the Balkans. I know from our diplomatic experience that, for example, Arab countries are either not intelligent enough or sometimes don't care enough about Turkish minorities in the Balkans. Their Turkish identity. They emphasize that there is Islamic identity, and it is not helpful. On the other hand, of course, in my service in Arab countries, in Syria, Iraq, I noticed that differentiation as Arab, non-Arab is not helpful. Okay. An example, for example, between Turkey and Germany, and between Turkey and France. Now we have a pillar of sustainable relationship is the Turkish community there. Okay. I think, in my opinion, also Turkish citizens went to Saudi Arabia, Libya, Kuwait, the same number as they went to the Gulf countries and Libya. Now we have around more 1.5 million Turkish origin citizens, German citizens of Turkish origin. Now they elected 18 or 19 MPs to the German Parliament, Bundestag. What I mean is that, of course, this also helps in building a sustainable relationship. Unfortunately, in these Arab countries, there is not, as far as I know, there is no considerable even resident permit for Turkish citizens. Even they work there 3 decades, all children are born there, they married there sometimes. These are the practical steps in the long run to make the relationships sustainable. TRT Arabia, for example, is a very good step by Turkish government. I am proud of it, the government of my party. It helped a lot in providing recognition among the public of both sides. Because why I am saying this, I saw especially in Mosul and Syria, there is a lot of stereotype, as Ayşe mentioned and implied in Turkish history. Sometimes from Turkish side, we take history as a positive element to contribute, but contrary, in these countries, especially in the bordering countries, it is used as a kind of blaming Turkey or as responsible for every problem inherited from Ottoman times. This is not true. So that's why this example, TRT Arabia, I hope the Arab countries can establish such channels or media opportunities to serve this end. Another sustainability element maybe is the coordination in Africa. You know, Arab countries, thanks to the geographic proximity and historic ties with Africa, may coordinate with Turkey in the Turkish-African policy, because it is a new initiative and it proved to be beneficial for both Turkey, Africa, and neighboring countries. So with the capital, with the human element, with the geographic proximity, both sides can coordinate also in Africa. Of course, one element, Tarek Bey, is that, of course, any establishment of any legal system, any political system, and sometimes any solid international relations require kind of minimum legal standards, domestic legal standards also, to host a diaspora, and sometimes to provide a friendly environment for investors, and sometimes to provide trust between the two countries. If you don't have this trust to the legal system or to the intentions of other countries, I saw this in Iraq, for example, any assertive measure, any assertive position by the other country may be perceived as a threat. I saw this in Iraq, for example, an innocent action by Turkey, any statement, innocent statement may be perceived as a kind of sectarian motivated agenda. So that's why if we have a transparency and legal standards, contemporary legal standards in our own countries, we don't need, for example, to blame each other, even in case of a small statement by an opposition group in your country against each other. It happens. It happens in Europe every day against Turkey. It happens within Turkey against our leader every day. And so this kind of, I think, steps will help us in improving and making the Turkish-Arab relations more sustainable. I stop here. I will be happy to listen also, Enes Bey, and to ask some questions also. I may ask some questions.
Of course, they will be coming. So thank you, Your Excellency. So just for me to sum up a little bit, so we had like 2 points of views. The first one by Ambassador Ayşe, and Ayşe Hanem was, gave us a very good overview about the Turkish foreign policy from an aspirational point of view, and how there are many pillars for this Turkish foreign policy, starting from dialogue, the need for sustainable dialogue with different countries, but especially Arab countries. The second tenet was about the seeking peace and humanitarian help, and dealing with multiple levels with the different countries. And the third tenet was about enhancing cooperation and engagement. And of course, Ayşe Hanem was kind of critical of some denomination that come whenever we bring Turkish foreign policy, such as the accusations of hegemony, accusation of Ottomanism and all. And the call here was to go beyond this mindset that is anchored in the 20th century, the imperial mindset, so to speak. And we need like to have more, emphasize more our interdependence and emphasize more on the areas of cooperation. From his side, His Excellency Ahmet Yıldız has come from a totally different point of view, from a practical point of view. And for him, sustainability is the key issue in the relation. For him, we need to move from the actor kind of format to the structure kind of format. So instead of behaving just like randomly, we need to formalize the relations and make sure that we take a lot of confidence building measures and practical steps to enhance the relations between Turkey and the neighbors. Of course, he has this criticism of the connotation of Arab, because there are many Turkish countries, there are many Arab countries, and the emphasis here should be more on the bilateral relations rather than on a notion that can be debatable about the Arab nation, etc., which are, maybe more idealistic than practical, and the need to address practically the issues, and they can be small issues and they can be big issues from a practical point of view, which means, for example, sometimes it's about helping diaspora, sometimes there are Turkish diasporas in Arabic countries, and vice versa, and then we can also deal with some legal standards and make them more contemporary rather than relying on informal structures. So these are some of the points that were raised by both our first speakers. So Mr. Altikriti, the floor is yours now to give us another perspective on the relations.
Thank you very much, Tarek, and my thanks and gratitude to TRT World Forum, and also my appreciation to both Their Excellencies Ayşe Hanım and Ahmet Bey for their excellent introductions, which lead me to focus on the Arab side of and the Arab perspective on this particular relationship. And I agree entirely with Her Excellency Ayşe Hanım that the problem is that when we talk about the Arab world, the implication is that we're talking about one homogeneous entity, an entity that is one. But in reality, we're talking about several entities, and amongst which there is a great disparity economically, politically, from the security perspective. But there is a shared issue, and I think that this poses one of the greatest challenges in terms of conducting this kind of relationship, or even trying to foresee the future for how this relationship can mature and can grow. And that is the fact that there is an absence of a shared national interest, which, let's say, the Arab world carries. And the reason for that is because of this disparity, this chasm between one country and another, this outlook between one country and another. And obviously, you will all know, you will all realize that the national interests are what are used as anchors in terms of any kind of dialogue between nations and nations, or countries and countries, or states and states. So without that kind of clear definition of what a national interest is for, let's say, this entity that is called the Arab world, it becomes nigh on impossible. And therefore you have to dictate your relationship based on country to country, which makes it very, very difficult. Obviously, the reason why national interests in terms of Arab countries are either ambiguous or probably even totally lacking is because in the Arab world, there is a problem of political legitimacy. There is an absence of democracy. There is an absence of due process in terms of governing state and society. And therefore, we have the kind of randomness and haphazardness of the kind of policies that we see. At this moment of time, one can describe the Arab world as being in a state of flux when it comes to foreign policy. We had, over the past decade or so, we had one or two axes that defined the state of the region, whether it be the Emirati, Saudi, Egyptian axis, for instance, whether it be the Qatari and then Turkish, Tunisian sort of axis, very, very loosely called. But at this moment of time, these have also disintegrated, and for the very same reason that I spoke about. Ahmed Bey spoke about the Turkish diaspora in various Arab countries, and which is a huge problem. But on the other side, the millions of Arabs who are either immigrants legally or illegally, or migrants who have settled in Turkey, 90% of them are dissidents. They're not people who have migrated, leaving on good terms with their own countries. Most of them have actually fled their countries for various political, probably socioeconomic reasons as well. But essentially, they don't constitute an anchor for this relationship to actually grow and to develop in a way that one would hope. I think that if we were to mark the status quo, I think that, you know, the persistence of conflict and violence on various levels, but generally speaking, whether it be state-sponsored or non-state-sponsored. I mean, for instance, the two Arab countries that were mentioned that neighbor Turkey, Iraq and Syria, are both unfortunately facing incredible internal challenges driven by various factors, and that pose themselves immense challenges for Turkey itself. You know, when you talk about countries where even the state itself isn't the most powerful or potent power within the state, such as when we see in Lebanon, for instance, when you have non-state actors that pose the most potent and powerful source of conducting political affairs within, it's an immense problem. Iraq, to an extent, is also similar to the state of Lebanon, and that is it's expected to continue for at least the foreseeable future. Economic instability and disparity. when we speak about the Arab world, we're talking about, several worlds, not just one world. We're talking about it from the economic perspective. We're talking about a part of the Arab world which is extremely rich, daring to even purchase parts of the superpowers in France and the UK and America and the such, possibly trying to settle their own disputes internally, by purchasing power in London or America, lobbies and the such. So we have an immensely rich part of the Arab world, and we have an immensely deprived and poor part of the same Arab world. And that also constitutes an issue as to, what kind of national interests gather these or share these people, if not states. The absence of democracy is a problem, and that's alluded to by what I spoke to about the absence of legitimacy. I mean, the problem is when you conduct a treaty or an accord or an agreement with a particular Arab country, the problem is that, that could change very quickly, simply because that state most likely does not carry the legitimacy of its own people, is not conducting this agreement or this particular treaty or the such based on consensus or upon approval or the such. And that is, I think, a huge problem. And obviously now we have, over the past 3-4 years, we have the issue of the normalization with Israel, which is incredibly problematic, not only to the region itself, but also, I think, to the relationship between the Arab world and Turkey. This kind of disparity in approach, as well as methodology and outlook, I think is problematic. The fact that this normalization, again, is carried out without the consensus, in fact, if anything, by the absolute opposition, and most of you who have served in Arab countries or lived in Arab countries will realize this, that, when you talk about normalization between any sector of Arab societies, you will find very strong opposition to that. So all of this brings about a question of deep instability underlying this particular relationship. Now, that doesn't mean that there aren't opportunities. I think that there are great opportunities, but that means that Turkey needs to, I believe, and I'm going to, put the onus a little bit on Turkey, maybe unfairly even, but the fact is that the Arab people tried over the past 10, 12 years. We went through the Arab Spring. The comeback from that and the backlash of that. Only recently we saw Tunisia also leave the Arab Spring Club, unfortunately. So the thing is, how is it possible that through Turkish influence, Turkish relations, and the fact that the vast majority of the Arab people, regardless of the overwhelming dominant narrative of state media, such as what Her Excellency Ayşe mentioned, the fact is that the Arab people have fondness, great fondness, and a feeling of kinship with the Turkish people. How can this be utilized in order to bring about an acceptance of a culture of democracy, of responsibility, of shared responsibility, and of building that kind of national interest that would serve then in culminating in a mature relationship on the basis of Turkey and the Arab world? I'll stop here. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Anas, for this thought-provoking questions and assertions that you have made. Well, if we, I think the perspective that you came from is the Arab perspective, and you outlined some of the deficiencies in the structural construction of the relations from an Arab point of view, the absence of democracy, the absence of or the lack of legitimacy, sometimes the role played by non-actors and other forms of interference in state business, and the fact that even if you do some good agreements with Arab states, there is a big chance that these agreements will never see the light simply because there are other interferences. So there are a lot of deficiencies that are connected with the Arab states and the condition in which the Arab world is currently living, and also the fact that the Arab Spring era, this last decade, was very demanding on many levels. but also the fact that the Arab people, most of them, and according to many surveys, are very fond of Turkey and Turkish foreign policy. So how can we capitalize on the same time on this fondness, while at the same time avoiding the pitfalls that are characteristic of the Arab political systems across the region? So without further ado, we will move to our discussants, and I will give the floor to Danya first, if you allow me. Danya Dafer, the floor is yours.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here, and it was nice to listen to our distinguished speakers today. Before delving into, I think, details, I know that this, I guess it was intentional to allow for a lot of discussion, naming the Arab world, as a political scientist, it can be a little complicated because you're talking about 22 sovereign nations, which are very diverse and have very different national interests. And you know, even in their authoritarianism, if you will, there's diversity. You have monarchies, you have personalist dictatorships, and there's so many different studies about how long these different kinds of authoritarian regimes actually last in history. The average is 9 years for personalist dictatorships to 50 years globally for monarchies. And I think it's just important to differentiate when you're just discussing in general about the Arab world. For me, I focused mostly on the GCC states. And I'm going to talk about like broader trends about the GCC that I think some of our speakers highlighted. So in terms of the Middle East, more broadly, there has been a change in how major international players have been engaging the region. And so this has caused regional actors, and namely in the Arab world, and of course, the non-Arab part of the Middle East as well, to look for new allies, new opportunities for cooperation. And this cannot be separated from the events over the course of the last 10 years with the Arab Spring, but also looking here in Washington, where I'm at. Of course, I'm Washington-centric since I'm located here. The transition from the Trump administration and how that affected the power dynamics of the GCC in terms of dealing with region-wide issues in the Middle East. One major issue, which our distinguished speakers did bring up, is how COVID affected the Middle East. And now all of these countries are kind of scrambling to attract foreign investment. And this has affected kind of the relations between the different nations as well. I mean, spending too much on conflict, you know, maybe not as worthy now. It's probably more worthy to emphasize on developing economically at home. And from the perspective of the Arab countries, I see that in general, there has been a gradual de-escalation with Turkey. And, you know, as the Arab Spring hit the broader Middle East, there were different vacuums that were established. And as we know that, you know, nature abhors a vacuum. And so all different players, including Turkey and the GCC states, attempted to assert its power to address maybe what would be viewed as security issues, maybe perhaps grab some more power, of course, in the region. And so I think there's a lot going on in terms of responding to all of these major changes that I just discussed. Main areas of contention could be in Libya, which, you know, UAE and Saudi had some issues as it pertained to that. Qatar obviously has a very different stance, and this is why I talk about the diversity of national interests in the Arab nations. Other issues is rivalry in the Horn of Africa, which we've witnessed. And, I guess you can't ignore, the attempted coup in Turkey that has been named something that was pushed forward by the UAE. So, and then there was the whole Khashoggi affair, which was a big one for Saudi Arabia. And all of these issues, I think, build up to different nations trying to achieve their interests and deal with the realities in the post-Arab Spring era. Now we're at a point where I think the dust is settling, if you will, and the marginal returns from conflict is really decreasing. And we saw in 2020 a period of normalization occurring and reconciliations happening across the Middle East. Love it or hate it, I mean, there was the Abraham Accords, the Al-Ula Agreement, which was an important one between the GCC. And I think that did resolve some of the, I guess I would say, challenges between Turkey having relations with other GCC states, namely Saudi and the UAE, and I guess by extension, Bahrain. Yes, by extension, Bahrain. And then so that was, I think, an important aspect that was kind of the blockade against Qatar, kind of by extension, also affected Turkish relations with other GCC nations. So there was many reasons that I named that caused that. Now, I think what we see now with the changes of going on here in Washington, it's really not clear. I mean, people have, I think, exaggerated in saying the US withdrawal from the Gulf. I mean, that's an exaggeration. I think, there's an adjustment of the role perhaps the US will play in the Middle East. And I do think that every time the US kind of adjusts its role, so do regional players kind of adjust their role as well. And I'm not taking away the agency of regional players. Of course, in the Middle East, there are very powerful actors. But there's a movement towards, as I was saying, towards regional security. And I think from the vantage point of the Arab Gulf states, there are three major powers that they're looking to regionalize security with. It's either Turkey, Iran, or Israel. And so that's why you see UAE and Bahrain normalizing with Israel. I think they looked at Israel as the least costly one out of those three. Qatar obviously chose its partner, and we know that it's Turkey, and Kuwait has been flirting with the idea, of course. Oman has, always kind of had similar policy, so I won't emphasize that much. I think the big question mark is about Saudi Arabia and who Saudi Arabia is going to align itself with regionally. Because we know that Israel is very problematic for Saudi Arabia since it's the custodian of Mecca and Medina, and its role in the Islamic world. I think it would make it very difficult to move forward with Israel, even though it has flirted with that idea. In reference to Iran, I think everyone that follows Saudi foreign policy know that Iran is not an option as a strategic partner. Now, Turkey remains, and there has been a back and forth between Turkey and Saudi Arabia, but I think there's a hesitancy with the Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman, given the recent events with Khashoggi. So I think that is the one interesting question mark from the perspective of GCC relations with Turkey, and it will be interesting to see how that relationship develops when you look at kind of the regionalization of security.
Thank you very much, Dr. Dania, for these inspiring words. I think we got to a little bit to the heart of the matter from a GCC point of view. And we are talking more about what are the areas of friction, let's say. Some of them are related to Libya, Horn of Africa, the attempted coup in 2016 in Turkey, the affair, the Khashoggi affair, and his grisly murder in Istanbul, and the blockade of Qatar. These are some of the areas of friction in the past 10 years. Now, of course, as Dr. Danya explained, the dust is settling a little bit, and people are again looking at these three major regional powers to formalize some security arrangements, whether it's Turkey, Iran, or Israel, and every protagonist has been choosing the partner of choice. So the floor now will be to Dr. Ufuk Ulutaş to bring another perspective into whatever has been discussed before.
Well, thank you very much, Tarek. Let me begin by wishing best of success to TRT World Forum this year. Thank you very much for putting together this wonderful panel of speakers. Much has been said so far with regard to the Turkish-Arab relations. And I'd like to take a slightly different approach, which was previously echoed by both Mr. Altikriti and also by Dr. Tahir. And to question, actually, the very basis of today's discussion. I think I'm not the only one who, when looking at the title of the event, the first two words that attracted my attention was the Turkish and Arab. What do we mean by Turkish and Arab? What do we exactly mean by those two terms? I think if we question that enough, we're going to navigate our way through the main question that we are addressing today. First of all, I think it would be very misleading to assume that there is one single monolithic group of either countries or even people that we can call Turkish or Arab for our purposes here today. The Middle East is anything but monolithic. The word Arab, for example, contained quite different socio-political and economic spectrums. And there is not only differences between countries and peoples, but also within the countries and peoples. Which Arab do we mean? I mean, states or people? Which region do we mean? The Gulf, the Levant, Maghrib? Which country in the Gulf, for example, do we mean? Qatar, Saudi Arabia, Oman, etc. I mean, there's a long list of questions to dig into the very basis of the argument that we are having or discussion that we are having today. Depending on which Arab we mean particularly, when we say Arab, we will most likely have a different level of relations and most importantly, a different perception of Turkey and vice versa. An average Jordanian's or Palestinian's perception of Turkey, for example, will be much different than that of a Lebanese Hezbollah supporter. A Qatari will most likely have a different and probably a very positive view of Turkey than an Assad supporter in Syria. On another level, we should take the differences between the state policies and public opinion into consideration too. For example, I don't think Egyptian public opinion are adequately represented in Egyptian policy making towards Turkey. We can say probably the similar things for the UAE too. As far as Turkey's relations with countries where Arabic is spoken predominantly, it's quite difficult to create categories and patterns like one-size-fits-all categories or patterns, which is valid for all. This will naturally have an impact on how we see Turkish-Arab relations going forward. Therefore, there will always be a set of countries where we will see close cooperation with Turkey is setting the mode. Others will have a different, a very cold approach, whereas some others will cooperate on a file basis. However, I think this will hardly change the perception of regional peoples towards Turkey, as regardless of where they are from, there is a sympathy, and this has been measured several times, but by different, public opinion polls done in the Middle East towards Turkey. I think unsimilar to any other regional country. The word I think here is the geopolitics, that we hear the concept of geopolitics a lot in the Middle East. But unfortunately, usually what we see is ideology sugar-coated by false geopolitics. And I believe that geopolitics command Turkey and Arab countries to cooperate and explore common points for mutual interest, rather than missing opportunities by some short-sighted ideological rifts. Turkey has always seen Arab countries as partners and countries with strong political, historical, and cultural ties. If we can pass over that narrow ideological readings, which is unfortunately very common in certain Arab capitals, there is a great potential in cooperation between Turkey and the general Arab world to use for the sake of regional stability and prosperity. I think the first thing we should do is to get rid of that sugar, which is quoting the false geopolitics that we have been discussing for the past maybe 10 years in the Middle East. Thank you very much.
Thank you for your intervention, Dr. Ufuk. And the point is well taken. I think it's the third speaker or intervenant that talked about the awkwardness a little bit of the title, but in fact it's an organizational thing. I mean, we cannot put Saudi, Emirati, Qatar, Oman, Maghreb, I don't know, Jazair, Tunis, Libya, like the whole thing could be
22 countries.
Yes, 22 countries. And if we say just the Middle East has other players besides this Arab-speaking nations, and we will have to include Iran and others, and and this is not the core of the conversation. So I hope you understand the point from an organizational point of view, but it's a very well made point, I think, from an analytical and academic point of view, that of course the notion of Arabness and Arab world is debatable because of the diversity, the multitude of races, ethnic groups, and languages spoken in the area. So I also thank you for raising this issue of ideological oriented policy making, and especially sometimes it's sugar coated, like you mentioned about with some false geopolitics. So I'm moving now to the next speaker, and it's my pleasure to leave the floor to Hafsa, Dr. Hafsa Halal.
Thank you very much. Thank you to TRT for the invitation. Thank you to distinguished guests and speakers, Your Excellencies, and Dr. Anas and the discussants before me. I concur with what has been said by Dr. Dania and Ambassador Ufuk, and I don't want to dwell on this issue of Arab nations or Arab world, except just to sort of harness, I think, some comments that were made about the question both of shared national interest, but also not only political legitimacy, but the question of democracy. And I think part of what this current moment is about across the wider Middle East is a moment of pragmatism, whether that be a question of US shifting role in the region, whether that be attempts for regional security arrangements amongst the countries, whether that be what I see as well, a more Arab desire to engage in regional security rather than be beholden to regional security architecture led by non-Arab countries, Iran, Israel, and Turkey, which is certainly a dynamic in and of itself. However, by virtue of geography, by virtue of strategic interest, by virtue of borders, there is and can be no such thing as a shared national interest across this entire region. You have countries that span 2 continents, you have countries in conflict, and countries that are more spoiler and aggressor and at times partner. It's just not viable, nor is it desired, I don't believe, in terms of sovereign interest of these countries. And to be quite frank, I think the question of political legitimacy and democracy, while certainly authoritarianism, and I can agree completely with the comments made by Dr. Altikriti about the lack of democracy and rise of authoritarianism in the region, both as a consequence of the Arab Spring in terms of how much harder it has been hit, but also as a consequence of regional conflict. This is not unique to the region, whether it be the pandemic, whether it be the financial crisis 13 years ago, whether it be a question of inequality. This is a global crisis. There is a question of political legitimacy in Europe with the rise of authoritarianism in Hungary and other countries, the question of European the ability of the European bloc to withstand that, financial crises in other countries, Brexit in the UK, the rise of Trumpism in the US, and Turkey itself also not immune. We've seen protests, Gezi Park 2013, put down quite violently. This is the attempted coup, as was mentioned. So this is a crisis on different levels and varying levels of democracy across the globe that has contributed to the rise of authoritarian global superpowers in China, in Russia, the power of the GCC states within their own region as well, and other powers that are able to contribute to this question, this real crisis that the world faces on different levels of where democracy goes from here, how we protect it, how we preserve it, and how we promote it. And that has played out domestically, regionally, and internationally across this region. I think if I am to make one important critique of some of the comments that were made, I think it is slightly disingenuous at this point in the last 10 years to ignore the aggressor role that Turkey has at times played, as have other Arab partners. It is not simply a one size, an argument that can only be portrayed in one light. And that the fault line in the region, rather than be Arab, non-Arab to a certain extent, has for many years been one of Islamist, non-Islamist. And that is a bigger question for future reconciliation, rapprochement, détente, however you want to shape the pragmatism that is currently being applied. That has been the defining fault line in a number of both conflicts and other re-emergent authoritarian states since 2013. That is a better way to describe the Turkey-Qatar alliance, the Egyptian, Saudi, Emirati axis, as it were. And as a result, there have been moments of Turkish aggression that cannot be ignored and that define what reconciliation will look like moving forward. That includes Iraq and the continued presence of Turkish military and air force activity in Nainiwa province and in parts of the Sinjar. Be it for national interest or not, it is Iraqi sovereign territory. That is a different discussion that has to be had with Iraqi leaders elected in a difficult but still continuing democratic process than, say, the conversation with proxy actors in Libya, which include Egypt, the UAE, France, Russia, and Turkey and Qatar. So it's very different perspectives in very different parts of the region. There is no Arab role currently being played within the Syrian peacemaking process, be it Astana, be it Sochi, and it is important that there is to be an Arab role in the reconciliation attempts and rehabilitation of Bashar al-Assad in Syria, notably because much of Syria remains ungoverned. There will have to be some forms of reconciliation that include Libyan actors as the Libyan process moves forward. There will have to be engagement with Arab countries in differing contexts depending on their national interests in the East Med, in the Red Sea, and in the Horn of Africa. All of that requires pragmatic leadership, pragmatic approaches, and an understanding that bilateral, as was said by His Excellency and Her Excellency Ambassador Ayşe, that there will be bilateral relations that take precedent over regional engagement. There are regional mechanisms that exist. The Arab League, whilst largely irrelevant, remains at least a convener and an opportunity to convene regional proposition and engagement. It is still somewhere that Arab foreign leaders use, Arab foreign ministers and leaders use to engage. And there will be other opportunities. Turkey seeks to be a partner in the East Med Gas Forum. That requires particular engagement with Egypt, Israel, and Lebanon, as well as its European partners. So there are different priorities, but what we are definitely seeing across the region, bilaterally and regionally, is an approach more to pragmatism rather than, as Ambassador Ufuk mentioned, ideological foreign policy, and that should in turn lead to more positive outcomes for all of the countries involved. And just a warning sign, countries that have had peace with Israel politically and security-wise for decades do not have cultural and social ties, whether these two questions for me are not mutually exclusive. There can be political reconciliation on a foreign policy level between countries, even where cultural and social ties remain fractured. And we can see the opposite, as we have done with other countries within the region, as cultural and social ties exist where political ties are fraught. Thank you very much.
Well, and thank you for your comments. I mean, some of them were quite strong, and I'm sure they will invite some strong response as well. Well, there is this, of course, what is clear is the moment of pragmatism. It's something that we can all agree about. There is a moment of pragmatism, not just in the US, but also in the region, whether from the Turkish side or from the counter kind of or so-called counter revolutionary axis, the UAE, Saudi Arabia, and Egypt, who have put a lot of water in their wine recently, after a lot of playing a big role as spoilers in many conflicts in the region. So we will have the opportunity to address many of these comments as we move forward. And the floor now is to you, Professor Tahir Kılavuz.
Thank you very much, Dr. Tarek. And thanks a lot for organizing this forum and this wonderful panel. And I thank their excellencies as well as Dr. Enes for their great presentations, as well as the fellow discussants. It's a blessing and a challenge to speak after such smart minds. It's a blessing because they summarize most of the things very well, but at the same time, I will be on a minefield to avoid repeating most of the things that they already said, but I'll try my best. So as it has already been mentioned, the region has been going through a transformation in terms of regional relations. So since the Arab Spring, the region was in different camps. Now it's changing with the developments in the last couple of years. The meetings we have witnessed in the Gulf, as well as the potentially changing relations between Egypt and Turkey, so on and so forth. So during the 2010s, Turkey took sides along with many other regional powers, and this has certain advantages and disadvantages for Turkey as well. But as the region is changing, probably it is time for Turkey to change its approach and as well as pursue a more multilateral, but at the same time, multi-layered approach. And actually we are seeing signs of these as well. But when we talk about a multi-layered approach, and when we talk about Turkey developing relations with certain states and groups, it comes with certain challenges as well. Which actors or which partners are Turkey going to choose in this new era? So like even in the last decade, when we were talking about Turkey had bad relations with Egypt, we were talking about the Egyptian state, not necessarily all Egyptian actors. As it is known, the relations with the Muslim Brotherhood was quite different. Or when we were talking about Turkey had good relations with Tunisia, it was mainly about the Tunisian state or the governments in Tunisia, but not necessarily in some of the main players in Tunisian politics. So what is Turkey going to do in this new era is going to be a question. Is Turkey going to prioritize the states or the governments or different groups within those countries? Or is it going to be state actors in one country or one region or one sub-region, and maybe different groups in a different sub-region? So this is going to be a big challenge for Turkish foreign policy in its approach to the Middle East. So, and it's not going to be easy. So even if it is changing, even if the relations in the Middle East are becoming relatively easier than the last decade for many actors, not just for Turkey, it's still going to be difficult whom to partner with. And probably at this point, it's quite important to understand whether Turkey is going to focus more on winning hearts and minds of the people as well. Obviously, this has been one of the purposes of the Turkish foreign policy in the last decades as well. Her Excellency mentioned that in her speech. And this is quite important to battle with the ideas of or the fear of Ottomanism or imperialism in the region as well. However, what is going to be quote unquote grand strategy of Turkey when approaching to the region? Is it going to be mostly about like big politics with the states again, or is it going to be prioritizing economic and social relations rather than big geopolitical issues? So these questions, the primary correspondence of Turkish policy in the Arab world or the Arab states is going to be the big question, I think. And one another thing I would like to raise at this point is that I'm actually like wondering, maybe this can be part of the discussion as well, what the Turkish approach is going to be when it comes to domestic politics of the Arab states. Because when we go back to 2000s, especially when it comes to political regimes, Turkey was calling for reform, not necessarily very strongly calling for regime change. But with the Arab Spring, Turkey moved to the side of supporting the movements of democratization and supporting regime changes, at least in some countries, not in all. But today, what is Turkish foreign policy shaping in this sense? Like, is it going to be calling for reform without democratization, or are we going to see calls for democratization from Turkey's side when it comes to domestic politics? At the same time, are we going to follow the same codes of the pre-2010s? Are we going to follow the same ideological divides in most of the Arab countries? So which aspects are going to be more salient? And probably for this, it's going to be important for Turkish foreign policy to understand the demands of the Arab citizens, because probably some of the demands are same with early 2000s, but some of them are changing. So looking at the protest movements in 2019 in different countries in the Arab world might be quite helpful to see the similarities as well as the differences in the demands of the Arab public between the early and late decade of the 2010s. So hopefully this new decade is going to be positive for Turkish and Arab peoples and Arab states relationship. And I'm sure everyone in this panel hope peace and prosperity in the region. And 2010s was it was a challenging decade with its ups and downs. It was hopeful, but it ended sourly. Hopefully the next decades will show us more positive turns than the last one. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Tahir Kılavuz, for these comments. Actually, it provides me with a good platform to launch my next set of questions, and this set of questions is for Ambassador Ayşe and His Excellency Ahmet Yıldız. So So using the last words of Professor Tahir, we know for a fact that the Turkish foreign policy had like 4 cycles in the last 6 years or so with vis-a-vis the Arab world, if we can use this this appellation. So the first, I mean, we can say from 1945 onwards until the 2000, Turkey was predominantly looking west, following a look west policy. And there were, there were some cordial relations with Arab nations and Arab countries, but there was no real sense of engagement with those, or strong engagement. And then came the 2002 to 2010, the era was more into stronger engagement with the Arab world and the zero policy, zero problem policy with the neighborhood, and an extension of economic relations, extension of social relations, extension of ties, economic, political, etc., with many Arab countries. Then came the third phase, which is the Arab Spring era and the split of the region between the different axes. Of course, Turkey sided with the democratic aspirations of the countries. However, there was another axis who had a different, I mean, we can call it the authoritarian axis, which tried to push back and peg back the region into different decades and establish the dictatorships, basically, and dictators in the region. And now we are now in the verge of a new era. It's still unclear, it's still shaping, it's still early stages of this era. So from your point of view, because you have been associated with the making of foreign policy and you know the system, you know how these things work, how do you assess this new era? Is it something structural, or is it just tactical? So I leave the floor to you, please, for more insights. So Ambassador Ayşe first, and His Excellency Ahmet.
Thank you very much. First of all, I completely agree with you about the shift of Turkish policy, although this is a soft shift, we can say, since the establishment of modern Turkey in 1923 and after the 2000s. This shift can be marked by the change of the perspective of engaging with the other parts of the world and also turning your face to your east, not only to the west. Of course, Westernization was one of the or pillars of Turkish foreign policy since the beginning of the establishment of modern Turkey. However, after the 2000s, Turkey preferred to pursue more proactive policies in the Middle East and in its east, indeed, in general. Ms. Halawa, for instance, talk about the aggressions of Turkey in the different parts of the Middle East, but I would rather call this as a proactive foreign policy of Turkey. This is the visibility and the appearance of Turkey, rise of Turkey in the region, rather than being aggressive. For instance, if you look at the discussions in Turkish politics today, sometimes the engagement with the Middle East still marked as you are diving into the muds of the Middle East, some politicians say about Turkey's engagement with the Middle East. But this is indeed re-establishing relations with your old friends, and I cannot categorize it like whether it is going to be relations with the administrations of those countries, put in brackets that they ask about their political legitimacy or democracy in those countries, but what can you do? This is the conditions of the, what can you do? This is the conditions of the Middle East. So you have to conduct your relations with the administrations of those countries. And then you will set up your economic relations, trade relations, and cultural and educational relations. Mr. Altikriti mentioned about how to utilize the love and understanding of Arab people of Turkish foreign policy in the region to make up our relations, to make our relations better with the Middle Eastern states. I think it is utilizing itself. It is working by itself, and it should have its own free space. There is high in the countries that the people are asking for going to Turkey, for having their holidays. They want to learn Turkish. They are learning by themselves. They are watching Turkish TV series. So this is, and this is realized by the governments also. The recent changes in the region is not, I don't consider it's only because of the change in the US administration, but also it's a push from the grassroots to their governments, which they have to take into account. During the pandemic, for instance, although all flights stopped from Oman to Turkey, they had to take off some special flights to Turkey by Oman Air because there was a huge demand coming from Omani people. So yes, what grand strategy Turkey has for the Middle East? I think the grand strategy is to stick to your principled position and conduct. It will be realized in time and appreciated in time. We continue to support democracy, but if they want to change their regimes, it's their desire, and they will do it by themselves. If they demand it, we support these demands. Reforms or whatever they want to change in their countries, it's going to be by themselves.
Okay, thank you. Yes, Your Excellency Ahmet Yıldız, do you have any other additions or?
Thank you, Tarek Bey. Yes, the grand strategy of Turkey towards the Middle East is and should continue to be the stability and peace in the region. Of course, political transitions are welcome in good way, in good direction, if they don't undermine the stability and security in the region. Having said all these about impediments between Turkey and Arab countries on improving relations, and having listened to others, I have never been pessimistic about Turkish-Arab relations, whatever it means, as you said on the record, because I know very well from the practice the added value of even a modest positive step in this direction is always huge. Returning to Hafsa's remarks, I think these interpretations of Turkish actions lack insight, lack regional insight. Okay, it sounds some kind of transatlantic insight. I know very well what is discussed there from my NATO powers. In Iraq, I know very well personally that if Turkey had not stood against the partition of Iraq, at some point it might have been divided. Turkey is there because Iraqi government, central government, cannot send Iraqi army to the Turkish border to control the Iraqi side of the border for their own reasons. That's why Turkey should be there. When the Iraqi leaders declared their call to the public, I don't think they mean it. On Syria also, I know from my work in the embassy twice there, Turkey unilaterally had the burden of controlling and securing the border for decades. Syrian government has not deployed any single soldier in the border to control flow of terrorism, terrorists, to control flow of smugglers, and to control other security threats. That's why any country bordering Syria would have done this. Any country bordering to Iraq would have done this. Still, Turkey is the country that aggressively defends still territorial integrity of Syria. Don't forget, two superpowers are there with, I think, some of hidden agenda, with suspicious agenda. So Turkey's presence there as a neighboring country, bordering country, is very relevant to the legitimate security, border security interest of Turkey. Of course, the relationship between Turkey and Arab world, of course, the foreign relations, international relations will be conducted between the states, between the parliaments, between the authorities, but also there will be people-to-people contact. It is unavoidable. Either individuals or chambers or civil society organizations. If you ignore that or you declare it unacceptable as a threat, you will lose. You should adjust yourself accordingly. If the public opinion of a country or part of the public is aspired by the policy of another country or by the statements, it is unavoidable. You should adjust yourself accordingly. You shouldn't take it as interference in international affairs. As I said, I am not pessimistic because we debate such things in Council of Europe, in NATO. I mean, the disputes in foreign relations, foreign issues, either territorial or others, much more than this. But we still keep under the same organization, on the same rules-based organization with the same values. Why can't we do this here? Yes. We shouldn't exaggerate the minor things to be impediment in the future of our relations. Of course,
if I may just interrupt you, Your Excellency. Thank you for the points you made, but we are really short on time, and we need to have some different interventions. So the points you raised are very, very important. I think primarily the relations between Turkey and Arab nations are in a good shape, and we should be optimistic about them. What do you think, Mr. Altikriti, about the outlook? I mean, I know there have been like such a drive for change in the Arab world, in Arab countries during the Arab Spring era, but a lot of people are talking about the Arab Spring in the past. And even though there have been a lot of countries that are not doing so well in terms of political stability, we have Algeria, we have Lebanon, we have Iraq, we have seen Sudan just a couple of years ago. So what do you think? Do you think that there will be a second wave, would it be affect these relations between Turkey and the Arab nations, or we should be more like seeking stability, pragmatism, and just doing business as usual?
I realize we only have a few minutes left, so I'll try to be very, very quick. But I believe that the incident and the advent of the Arab Spring is a truly historic one, and that its impact is indelible. It'll remain with us, and it'll have its aftershocks. And I believe that we will see aftershocks, whether they serve the cause of true freedom and liberation for the Arab people, or otherwise that remains to be seen. However, I would agree with Hafsa in terms of we have a global problem that we are all impacted by, whether it be political and diplomatic and state legitimacy, whether it be populism that came with Trump and with the EU referendum in the UK and the such. And that's something that we're also seeing in terms of how the media narrative is conducted in terms of the relationship and how it impacts foreign policies between the Arab countries and Turkey and the such. However, I tend very timidly, I have to say, and cautiously, to share His Excellency Ahmet Yıldız's optimism regarding the general outlook. I think there's going to be a very, very bumpy ride, economically, security-wise, and in terms of how the current conflict still raging, whether it be in Syria, whether it be in Libya or Yemen, how they will come to settle or calm down or become part of the future anyway. But I share his optimism, and I hope that when we come to meet next year, we'll be talking about some successes.
Excellent. Thank you for that. I would like to move to the next. I mean, we have still a few minutes, and my question is for you, Hafsa Halawa. I mean, I know you made these comments, and I understand this perspective exists, but we have heard our speakers talk about it, and the fact that a lot of these interventions are actually in agreement and in harmony with the other states, and there are conventions, and sometimes it's also about countering terror. And we have seen other nations doing that, whether the United States, France, whether nations in the Middle East. I mean, we have seen the Egyptian aviation attacking a city, the city in Libya, targets in the city in Libya. We have seen the UAE, Saudi Arabia planes creating havoc in Yemen. So the notions of sovereignty and all that you raised are very valid points. But however, there is the context of it, the context of fighting terror. So you also spoke about some other very interesting prospects about how we can move from the ideological part of the conception of international relations to more pragmatic. How do you see this moment of pragmatism? Do you see it like, as somebody who's following the situation in the Arab world, do you see this moment of pragmatism lasting, or are we gonna revert back to the old ghosts of the past?
Oh, I'm not quite sure what ghosts of the past means, but I would, to your first point, I think I reiterate, in the same vein that if I'm talking to people who support Hezbollah or support Iran or support Egypt's military action in Libya or the UAE or France or Russia or the United States, I was anti-Iraq War 2003, I am Iraqiyya. I find it disingenuous. At the end of the day, you want to speak to the people of Sinjar, of Nainiwa, of parts of Iraq, of parts of Syria, whether they are in dealing with bombardment from Russian airplanes, whether they are caught between the proxy powers under siege in Homs or Daraa or Idlib, and ask, it's not a question of who is the better proxy fighter. It is simply a fact. Proxy aggression within sovereign borders is what it is, whether you are Turkey, whether you are Iran, whether you are the Emirates, Qatar, Egypt, or whoever. That is a simple fact. The pragmatism that comes from acknowledging that there is proxy engagement, for example, on Syria, we have the Astana process of the three major powers involved in the Syrian conflict. And my argument is that there should be Arab representation at that table, because Syria is a country led within the Arab populace and has relations with the Arab nations in as much as it does the wider Middle East and non-Arab partners. So it's not a question of me taking a position on Turkish foreign policy. I am anti-conflict, I am anti-proxy conflict, whether you're Iran, whether you're Israel, whether you're Turkey. It doesn't matter to me what the party is. So again, there just needs to be a simple acknowledgement of where countries, and that goes for all of them. But to the question that you mentioned about pragmatism and where that will come from, to be quite blunt, I think it's going to come from the economic need to build these kinds of relationships in the region. For Turkey, there are simple realities. Accession to the EU is dead. It is not going to happen. Therefore, East-Med relations with other partners in the neighborhood is of paramount importance. That includes Egypt, that includes Israel, that includes Lebanon. For Egypt, conflict in Libya on its borders, water crisis in the Horn of Africa, transition in Sudan, continuing instability in Gaza requires that it makes peace with varying countries that have involvement in those countries, along with an energy crisis in terms of natural gas reliance and the need to ensure a domestic gas supply, economic. Again, the same goes for a lot of countries emerging from post-pandemic or emerging into post-pandemic recovery. Economics will lead the pragmatism, hopefully, and I agree with the previous speakers about the optimism. You know, a very dear friend in Yemen once told me that the only time you finally find peace in conflict is when everyone is done fighting, when there is no fighting left to be done. And I think primarily we're at that stage. My fear is for Syria that will resolve into no war, no peace. And at the same time, that proxy actors will not take into account enough the agency of citizens of these countries as they come to their own security arrangements.
Thank you for the clarification. Now I would like to get the words of Dr. Ufuk. We have seen a lot of mischaracterization, misconception, misconstruction of Turkish foreign policy. We have seen a lot of academic works, if we can call them academic, trying to find or trying to label the Turkish foreign policy as Ottomanism, neo-Ottomanism, as something as Turanism, something like that. Why is such prevalent, very misconstrued view of Turkish foreign policy is that way? Why aren't we seeing Turkey for what it is, like pragmatism and just geopolitics 101?
Well, I don't want to turn back to my initial point of, we shouldn't generalize when we talk about the Arab world and their perception of Turkish foreign policy. I mean, the last public opinion poll conducted through, several Arab states actually states that, the support among the Arab populace, to Turkish foreign policy is higher than any other, extra-regional actor. If you compare it with China, Russia, Iran, Saudi Arabia, etc. So you will see higher support for Turkish foreign policy than the other actors. This is the poll conducted by an Arab think tank. So there's always one side of the picture and the other side. The other side of the picture involves lots of, misinformation campaigns using academia or think tanks or newspapers, media, in order to further one's national interest. And we know that certain countries are quite powerful in terms of their sphere of influence among those academic and media actors. I think one key word here to use is the reality, and some of the previous speakers use the word reality. I love the word reality, and we are living in our own realities. From time to time when I travel to the Northern Europe, for example, Switzerland, I always find myself thinking, what would have happened if Turkey was surrounded by countries like Austria, Liechtenstein, Germany, France, Italy? I'm sure from time to time, Jordanians ask that question to themselves too. We are living in our own reality. Turkey is surrounded by at least two countries where there was a civil war, a couple of years ago. A terror organization called ISIS was controlling 1/3 of the country. Now in Syria, there is one terror organization, which is PKK, which is active on the Turkish border. Another one, in the northwestern part of Syria, Al-Qaeda, which is still active. The country is divided in certain, let's say, districts, and there are at least two actors, Iran and Russia, which has been ruling the country for years. I'm not talking about the inner workings of the Iraqi state at this point. So a country like Turkey, which is, which has to control its borders, of course, doing military operations to, let's say, to ban and curb the influence of terror organizations alongside its border. I wish we had Liechtenstein, on our border, so we act differently. By the way, I'm quite happy with Syria and Iraq as neighbors. I'm not talking about them as bad neighbors, but we're talking about realities on the ground, which is that the stability is a big question, and there are non-state actors which are active on the ground alongside the Turkish borders, which unfortunately force countries like Turkey to step forward and secure their own borders. I think this is what has been happening between Turkey and certain Arab countries in the border.
Thank you very much for the clarification. And I have a follow-up question for Dr. Dania. So now we have seen like these shifts, these realignments, and but we still also know that there are some linkages and connections to the past and issues like whether the Khashoggi affair, the blockade of Qatar. But we are seeing also the movement beyond these problems into more reconciliation, or at least some overtures at this stage. It remains to be seen whether they will be fruitful or not. What is your kind of forecast? Do you think the evolution of the relations between Gulf states and Turkey will be in the positive side, or Saudi Arabia will remain entangled into their internal problems, their conflict in Yemen, other places? And what about the UAE? Are they genuinely seeking like reconciliation, or is it just a tactical move?
Those are all good questions. I do think at this point, the way I see it from a macro perspective is now everyone, the Middle East was in a negotiation era of negotiating major issues in the region. And I think each state attempted to, can you hear me? It says my internet.
Yeah. No, we hear you loud and clear. But please, in 1 minute, because we need to have some final remarks for
big questions Tahir. In 1 minute. Well, I think
just optimism or pessimism.
Okay. Well, I'm very particular about the word optimism. I think there's a lot that needs to be done in the region. Of course, we are moving towards de-escalation when it comes to major powers being involved in issues across the Middle East. But we cannot ignore the fact that the Arab people have lost a lot in all of these conflicts. We have a humanitarian crisis with displaced refugees and all of these issues. Now, going back to the GCC and reconciliation with Turkey, I think it's definitely moving in a positive direction. There has, and when I say positive, I mean in the fact de-escalation, not positive. And I think we're going into this really happy-go-lucky era. I mean, there are realities on the ground that needs to be taken into consideration when you look at the future of the region. That are very serious questions about stability coming into the future. But to just gloss over your question within 1 minute, I do think that these countries have negotiated and grabbed what they could, and now it's time to sit at the negotiation table, because the marginal cost for conflict or the marginal gains for conflict has decreased so much in this last couple of years that these states realize it's in their interest to sit down and go to the negotiation table.
Thank you for that. And Mr. Tahir, Dr. Tahir, what are your final remarks? In 1 minute, please.
I know we're pressed by time, so I won't keep it long. Actually, my final remarks in the previous round were pretty much similar to what I would like to say right now. The last decade have been quite challenging. I share optimism to some extent with the fellow speakers, but at the same time, we have to define what kind of optimism we expect, because if you're talking about optimism in economic development or regional relations or peace or democracy, these are not necessarily mutually exclusive, but they don't go hand in hand in every case. Unfortunately, in terms of human rights and democratization, I'm a bit less optimistic, I wish, but in terms of like developing bilateral relationships, hopefully more peaceful and stable region, and hopefully economic development, I see that there are more positive direction, but I hope we can see similar positive outcomes in terms of democratization as well. Thanks.
Thank you very much. You summed up very well the kind of feelings that we have at the end of this discussion. I would like to thank you all for your participation and your sharing with us your insights. We will never do justice to the relations between Turkey and the neighborhood and the Arab nations in general in 1 hour and a half. It's a long subject, but I'm sure we gathered some very important insights and very important comments from all the participants. Thank you very much again. And we hope to host you once more in the different platforms of TRT and different events of TRT World. Thank you very much and have a lovely day ahead.